All right, let's dive into this. Real-world evidence, RWE. It's all about what happens after a drug gets approved, you know, beyond those initial clinical trials.
Yeah, exactly. It's about looking at how the drug actually performs out there in the real world with all its complexity.
Right, because those clinical trials, they can only tell us so much. RWE taps into a whole different kind of information.
It does. Think about it. Patient medical records, insurance claims, even those fitness trackers and smartwatches people are wearing, all of that data can contribute to this big picture of how a drug is really working.
And you're particularly interested in how that data gets collected and used, right? Especially when it comes to decisions about drugs that are already on the market.
Exactly. Like, how does RWE impact things like post-marketing approvals or even those big drug recalls you hear about sometimes?
Okay, so before we get into those specifics, let's set the stage a bit. We've got all these regulations, right? Like 21 CFR 211. That one's all about how drug companies have to manufacture their products.
All right, it covers everything: facilities, equipment, the whole process. It's basically trying to ensure that the drug is made to a certain standard right from the start.
So it's kind of like a safety net, right? Try to minimize any risks before the drug even reaches patients.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even with those really strict regulations, sometimes real-world use reveals information that those clinical trials just didn't catch.
Because those trials, they have a limited number of people, and the conditions are super controlled.
Yeah, exactly. So RWE comes in and shows us what happens when the drug's used by a much wider, more diverse group of people in all kinds of different situations.
And those insights, they can be really crucial when it comes to drug safety. Remember that thalidomide tragedy?
Right, absolutely. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when you don't have a good system for monitoring drugs after they're approved.
It really drives home why your focus on data collection is so important. If we want to prevent those kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Absolutely. And that tragedy, it really was a turning point. It led to stricter regulations, a much bigger emphasis on keeping a close eye on drugs after they hit the market. And RWE is now a huge part of that.
So RWE can help us spot potential problems early on, which could then lead to changes in how the drug is labeled, maybe new warnings added, or even a recall in some cases.
Right. It's all about constantly reevaluating the balance, weighing the benefits of the drug against any potential risks, even years after it's been approved.
And speaking of recalls, that's something you're really interested in understanding, right? Like how RWE can actually lead to a drug being pulled off the market.
Yeah, I am. It's a complex process, but basically RWE can uncover those serious safety issues that just weren't apparent in those initial trials. 21 CFR 216, that's the one with the list of all the withdrawn drugs. Let's take a look at one. Diethylstilbestrol. DES, it's called.
Oh, yeah, DES. I remember that one. It was prescribed to pregnant women, wasn't it?
It was. Marketed as this wonder drug, supposed to prevent miscarriages. But then, years later, a disturbing pattern emerged. A rare type of vaginal cancer started showing up in the daughters of women who had taken DES while they were pregnant.
Wow. So it wasn't caught in the initial trials, only came to light through real-world use. And it took a whole generation for those effects to become apparent.
It did. It really underscores the importance of long-term monitoring. And in this case, that crucial RWE came from patient registries, those observational studies that followed these women and their children over time.
So DES is this powerful example of why we need RWE, especially when we're trying to identify those long-term effects that don't show up right away.
And think about the impact of that DES recall. It was huge. Patients were terrified, doctors scrambling to figure out how to care for them, complete chaos.
And of course, the company that made the drug. Lawsuits, financial losses, their reputation just shattered.
Exactly. And that brings us to a key point. RWE isn't just about protecting patients, though that's obviously the most important thing. It's also about maintaining trust in the entire healthcare system.
Because when something like that happens, it shakes everyone's confidence, right? Not just in that specific drug, but in the whole system.
Right. But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
RWE can be a force for good, too.
It is. It can show us how well a drug works in different groups of people. That lets us tailor treatments based on someone's age, ethnicity, even their genes.
So it's moving us toward personalized medicine in a way.
Exactly. Remember our discussion about those complicated drug regimens? Patients taking multiple medications at once.
Oh, yeah. That's where things can get tricky.
RWE can shed light on how those drugs interact, maybe help us avoid dangerous combinations, or even find combinations that work really well together.
So it's like having a detective on the case, piecing together this giant puzzle.
Great analogy. And as we get better at collecting and analyzing all this data, that detective work is going to become even more powerful, which hopefully means safer and more effective medications for everyone.
That's the goal, isn't it? But it's not without challenges.
Mhm.
There's so much data coming in from so many different places. How do we even begin to make sense of it all?
That's one of the biggest hurdles, the sheer volume of information. We need better tools, better technology to manage and analyze all that data.
Right, it's like drinking from a fire hose. And then there's the issue of making sure all that data is accurate, reliable, ethically sourced.
Absolutely. Patient privacy and data security are crucial. We can't sacrifice those things.
It's a balancing act, but one we have to get right.
It is. It's not just about the data itself. It's about using it responsibly, ethically, to improve patient care.
And having those guidelines and regulations in place, like the ICH guidelines we talked about earlier, they help ensure that all of this is done the right way.
Absolutely. Those guidelines provide the framework for how to conduct RWE studies, how to analyze the data, how to make sure the evidence is solid.
It's like a set of rules for the game, making sure it's played fairly.
Right. And just like the world of RWE itself, those rules are constantly evolving. We're seeing new guidelines emerge all the time, addressing specific challenges like using data from wearable tech or integrating RWE earlier in the drug development process.
So it's a dynamic landscape, but ultimately it's all pushing towards better, more patient-centered healthcare.
That's what it's all about, using real-world data to make healthcare more effective, more efficient, more accessible for everyone.
Right. This has been a fantastic dive into real-world evidence. We've covered a lot, from those core regulations to the intricacies of data collection and the impact on drug approvals and those sometimes dramatic recalls.
We've seen how RWE can uncover hidden risks, help us fine-tune those treatments, and even play a role in the evolution of personalized medicine.
Back again, digging deeper into real-world evidence.
We covered a lot in part one, starting with the FDA regulations, how data is gathered, and even how RWE impacts things like drug approvals and those recalls.
Now we're kind of shifting gears though, right? Remember those strict manufacturing rules we talked about? 21 CFR 211.
Right, all about minimizing those impurities in the drugs.
And I gotta admit, I'm not totally seeing how impurities connect to real-world evidence. Seems like we're going off on a tangent.
It might seem that way, but bear with me. It all ties together. Remember, those regulations are all about building quality in right from the start during the manufacturing process.
So when we talk about impurities, we're talking about anything that ends up in that final drug product that's not supposed to be there.
Exactly. Could be stuff from the ingredients, from the manufacturing process itself, even from the packaging. And the thing is, even tiny amounts can mess with how safe and effective a drug is.
Makes sense. Like a little piece of dirt in a complicated machine throws the whole thing off.
Exactly. That's why regulators are so focused on those impurities. They want to make sure every batch of the drug is pure and consistent.
Okay, so back to my question. How do these impurities connect to RWE? Still working on connecting those dots.
All right, picture this. A drug gets approved based on clinical trials, right? But those trials used a drug with a certain level of impurities. Then, out in the real world, something changes during manufacturing.
Like they switch suppliers for an ingredient or try to make the process more efficient somehow.
Exactly. And even those little changes can cause a jump in impurities in the final product.
And we don't really know how those new impurities will affect people because they weren't in the original trials.
Exactly. And that's where RWE comes in. It helps us spot those unexpected changes.
So if we start seeing more bad reactions reported through patient records or databases, that could be a sign that something's up with the drug itself.
Right. It's like RWE acts as an early warning system, It tips us off to problems that might have been missed by the usual quality checks.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So RWE isn't just about watching how the drug affects patients. It's also about watching the drug itself, making sure it stays consistent and safe.
You got it. And that's another reason those ICH guidelines are so important. They have this whole framework for dealing with impurities, like setting limits for what's acceptable, doing those stability studies.
Right, stability studies. We talked about those a bit when we were looking at the common technical document. It's all about how the drug holds up over time, right?
Exactly. And those studies are crucial because they can show if those impurities are increasing over time, which, could impact the drug's quality and safety.
So it's like this ongoing checkup, making sure the drug stays within acceptable limits as long as it's on the shelf.
Exactly. And RWE provides the real-world feedback, helping us fine-tune how we control those impurities, making sure the drug stays safe and works the way it should.
Wow. This conversation's been really eye-opening. The whole impurity thing, I wouldn't have thought about it.
It's an important piece of the puzzle, though. And it shows how RWE can be that early warning system, even for subtle changes that could affect patients.
And those regulations from the FDA and those ICH guidelines, they're crucial in making sure the drugs are top-notch, consistent, and safe.
Absolutely. It's a complicated field, constantly changing, but it all boils down to keeping those patients safe, making sure the drugs they need are effective and trustworthy.
And we're back, wrapping up our deep dive into the world of real-world evidence.
We've been through a lot, haven't we? All those drug regulations, the ins and outs of collecting data, even how those impurities can impact patient safety unexpectedly.
And now, the grand finale.
Yeah.
Quality by design. QBD, you mentioned this before.
Ah, yes, QBD. This is where it gets exciting. It's all about making sure quality is built into every single step of making a drug, from the very first idea to that final product you see on the shelf.
So refresh my memory. What's the difference between this QBD and the way drugs were traditionally developed?
Well, think about it. In the past, it was more of a reactive approach. Make the drug, test it, and then fix any problems that popped up later, after it was already being used.
Wait and see kind of thing.
Exactly. But QBD flips that around. It's like saying, let's get to know this drug and the whole process of making it inside and out right from the get-go. That way, we can see those potential problems coming and design them out.
So it's more holistic, looking at everything that could affect the quality of the drug and putting those controls in place to keep things consistent and safe.
You got it. It's like having this super detailed roadmap for the whole process with every step planned out, documented, and with those quality checks all along the way.
I'm following you. But how does all of this connect back to real-world evidence?
That's the best part. QBD actually lays the groundwork for even better data collection and analysis, especially when the drug's out there being used in the real world.
Now you've got my attention.
Imagine this. When you've got that deep understanding of the drug and how it's made, you can design those RWE studies to be much more focused and give you more useful information. You're collecting data on those specific things that are critical to quality.
I see. So the data from the real world can then be used to make the drug and the process even better.
Precisely. It's like a feedback loop, constantly improving things.
This is really making sense now. So with QBD, you're not just reacting to problems later on. You're preventing them from happening in the first place.
And that proactive approach is revolutionizing drug development. More efficient, fewer expensive mistakes, and ultimately safer, more effective meds for patients.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered in this deep dive into real-world evidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's everywhere, impacting drug approvals, how we monitor those drugs after they're out there, and even shaping the future of drug development with this whole quality by design concept.
It's been a journey, hasn't it? We've seen how RWE can help us spot those hidden dangers, make those treatments work even better, and even contribute to that exciting world of personalized medicine.
And let's not forget the big picture. It's all about ensuring the safety and well-being of those patients. That's what really matters.
Couldn't agree more. It's been a pleasure diving into all of this with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And remember, when it comes to our health, knowledge is power. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay informed.